Hey, my name is Adrian Hale. I'm 36, and for 2 years I've hosted the early morning show at a small public radio station in Savannah, Georgia. The kind of program people put on when they can't sleep or don't want to sit with their own thoughts alone. Every Sunday, before the city wakes up, I drive out to Oak Haven Cemetery to see my wife, Claire. That particular Sunday in November, I almost didn't get out of the car because somebody was already kneeling at her grave. The fog hadn't burned off yet. It sat low over the oaks, catching in the gray beards of Spanish moss, and the gravel path was slick enough that I could hear my own boots before I saw much else. Oak Haven backs up against a tidal creek, and most mornings the smell of the marsh works its way into everything. The flowers, my coat, the inside of my own chest, if I let it. I had a small bundle of camellias in one hand, the pink kind Claire used to cut from her mother's yard every winter, and I was already rehearsing the same one-sided conversation I had with her every week when I saw the woman. She wasn't standing. She was kneeling in the wet grass in front of Claire's headstone, one hand pressed flat against the granite like she was trying to feel a pulse through it, her shoulders shaking in a way that had nothing performative about it. This was not a woman posing for grief. This was the real thing. I stopped walking. For a second, I actually considered turning around, because some part of me, the part that had spent 2 years guarding this 1 hour of the week like it belonged to nobody but me, wanted to protect it. But she wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I. So I cleared my throat the way you do when you don't want to startle someone. She turned so fast she nearly lost her balance in the wet grass. Her coat was plain wool, buttoned wrong at the top, and pieces of her hair had come loose from wherever she'd tied it back, sticking to her wet cheeks. She looked at the flowers in my hand, then at the headstone, then at me, and I watched the exact moment she understood who I was. I'm sorry. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her face with the back of her wrist like that would undo the last 5 minutes. I didn't think anyone would be here this early. I'll go. You don't have to go. I don't know why I said it. 2 years of Sunday mornings alone with Claire, and the first thing I did when a stranger interrupted them was invite her to stay. Who are you? She looked back down at the headstone, and something in her face folded, like she'd practiced an answer 100 times on the drive here, and none of the words wanted to come out in the right order. My name is Nina Calder. Her eyes came back up to mine. I know this looks strange. I'm not unwell or dangerous or anything you're probably thinking right now. I wasn't thinking either of those things, which was almost true. But I am wondering why you're crying at my wife's grave. She was quiet long enough that a bird somewhere in the oaks finished an entire verse of whatever it was singing. When she finally looked up again, her eyes were red-rimmed but steady, like she'd decided something. He told me to find you, she said. He. The word landed strange in the cold air. Who's he? She opened her mouth, then closed it, and I watched her try a different door. Can we sit somewhere? I don't want to explain this standing over a grave. It feels wrong, saying it here. There's a bench about 30 feet down the path, iron and half-rusted, facing the pond where the groundskeeper feeds the ducks every morning. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at this stranger who'd been crying hard enough to fog her own words, who knew exactly which grave was Claire's without a map, who had said he like I was supposed to already know who she meant, and felt the particular vertigo of a Sunday that was clearly not going to go the way every other Sunday for the last 2 years had gone. Okay. I nodded toward the bench. Let's sit. We took opposite ends of it, the right amount of distance for two strangers who'd just met over a headstone. I set the camellias down between us instead of laying them on the grave yet, some instinct telling me this conversation needed to happen first. Claire was a hospice nurse, I told her, because it seemed like the kind of fact a person should know before anything else got said between us. 9 years at Marshview, taking care of people at the end of their lives. She died 2 years ago this December. An aneurysm, no warning, no illness beforehand. One Tuesday, she was making coffee and telling me a story about a patient's grandson, and by Wednesday night, she was gone. I looked at the pond instead of at Nina. She was 32. Nina nodded slowly, like she already knew some version of this, or had imagined it enough times that hearing it confirmed didn't surprise her. My father's name was Walter Calder. He had a bad heart for almost 6 years, cardiomyopathy, the kind that wears the muscle down until it can't keep up. He was on a transplant list for 14 months, and then, 2 Decembers ago, he got a call in the middle of the night that a heart had become available. Something dropped in my chest, slow and heavy, the floor tilting right before you understand you're about to fall. He got Claire's heart, not a question. I already knew. Yes, Nina's hands were folded tight in her lap. He got 22 more months because of your wife. He used to joke that he was going to make every single one of them count. And he tried. He really tried. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her knuckles against her mouth for a second before she could keep going. He died in September, not his heart. His heart never gave him a single problem, not once. It was his lungs, an infection that came on fast, the kind that happens sometimes when the medication that keeps your body from rejecting an organ also keeps it from fighting off everything else the way it should. I didn't know what to say to that, so for a while I said nothing at all. The pond made small sounds. Somewhere behind us, a sprinkler clicked on with a hiss. "I'm sorry," I finally managed, "about your father. I'm sorry about your wife." She looked at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. I know that sounds strange, apologizing to the person whose loss gave my father his life. I've thought about that a lot. How grateful and how sorry can live in the same sentence. I thought about all the nights over the last 2 years I'd wondered what happened to Claire's heart. The transplant coordinator had told me, gently, that a 59-year-old man with heart failure had received it, that he had a family, that he was doing well as of the last update they were allowed to share. That had been almost 2 years ago. I hadn't heard anything since. I'd assumed, the way you assume things you don't have the energy to chase down, that no news was fine news, that somewhere out there Claire's heart was still doing its quiet, stubborn work. There was a letter. The memory arrived sideways, like it had been waiting behind a door for 2 years. About a year after Claire died, the donation program let me write to your father. Anonymous, the way they set it up. I signed something too, giving them permission to share my name later if he or his family ever wanted contact. I looked at Nina. Did he get it? Something shifted in her face. She reached into the canvas bag at her feet and pulled out a small wooden box, the kind you'd keep a watch or a pocket knife in, holding it in her lap without opening it. He got it. He read it so many times the paper started going soft at the folds. He tried to write back 4 different times. I found all 4 drafts in this box after he died. He never finished a single one. Her thumb moved over the box's edge, back and forth, a nervous habit worn smooth over months. After he died, I went back through the transplant coordinator, mostly out of grief, not really expecting anything. They told me you'd already consented to contact and gave me your name. Savannah and an obituary did the rest. She looked up. That's what he meant at the end. On one of his last nights, when he could still talk clearly, he grabbed my hand and made me promise, find him. Find her husband. Don't let it go unsaid the way I did. The fog was starting to lift off the pond, thin gold light coming sideways through the oaks. I looked at the little wooden box like it might start speaking on its own if I stared long enough. I have 9 days. Nina beat me to the next question. I arranged the time off with my school. I got into Savannah before dawn this morning, and I spent 4 hours in a rental car outside this cemetery trying to work up the nerve to actually come in. She almost smiled, though it didn't quite reach all the way. I wasn't even going to come find you today. I was going to visit her grave by myself first, and then decide. What changed your mind? Nothing changed my mind. You just got here before I finished deciding. I thought about Margaret then, Claire's mother, who called every Sunday evening to ask if I'd been eating, who kept a photo of Claire on her mantel lit by a candle that never seemed to go out. I thought about how she'd react to a stranger at the grave she visited on Wednesdays, and felt a flicker of something I didn't want to name yet. I set it aside. It was too soon to borrow trouble from a conversation that hadn't happened. Can I see them? I asked, nodding at the box. The letters he tried to write? Nina's hand tightened slightly around the lid. Not yet. I want to give them to you finished, not half done. Is that all right? Can you wait? I looked at the camellias sitting between us, already starting to wilt in the morning cold, and thought about how I'd waited 2 years for a reply that never came, and somehow that made 9 days feel like nothing at all. I can wait. Monday morning she came to the station. I hadn't exactly invited her. I'd mentioned, walking her back to her car, that I'd be on air at 5 if she ever wanted to watch a grown man talk to nobody in an empty room for 2 hours, taking the occasional call from a trucker or a nurse coming off a night shift. And I hadn't expected her to actually show up, hollow-eyed and holding 2 coffees, at 4:45 in the morning. I don't sleep well here, she admitted, handing me one of the cups. Might as well not sleep somewhere interesting. I gave her the good headphones and let her sit just outside the glass while I ran through weather, a birthday shout-out for a woman turning 91 in Pooler, and 40 minutes of the kind of quiet piano music that exists mostly to keep lonely people company until sunrise. Nina mouthed, "This is it," at me during a song break, half amused, half something softer, and I mouthed back, "This is it," and meant it more than the joke deserved. My producer, Priya, took one look at Nina sitting quietly in the corner of the booth during the broadcast and cornered me at the first music break. "Who is that?" It wasn't really a question. "And why do you look like a man who just remembered he has a pulse? It's complicated. Everything about you is complicated, Adrian. You turned down a date with my sister-in-law's co-worker back in June by claiming a shellfish allergy. And then the restaurant she picked was Italian." Priya crossed her arms. "This feels different. Explain." I didn't, not that morning. But by Wednesday, when Nina came by again with pastries instead of coffee, and a question about why I always played the same slow piano song at 6:15, I found myself telling her the shellfish story before she'd even finished asking. She laughed hard enough to set her coffee down, and something in my chest unclenched that had been tight for so long I'd stopped noticing it was there. On Tuesday evening, between those 2 visits, she came by my apartment to return a book I'd lent her at the station, and found me standing in the doorway of what used to be Claire's closet, still exactly as it had been 2 years ago, because I had never once managed to make myself sort through it. "You don't have to explain." She rolled up her sleeves before I'd even finished trying to. "Where are the donation boxes?" For the next 2 hours we worked mostly in silence, folding sweaters that still smelled faintly of a perfume I hadn't let myself think about in longer than I wanted to admit. She didn't rush me. When I stopped, holding a cardigan too long, she sat down on the floor across from me and waited until I was ready to keep going. "My mother still has every one of my father's shirts," she said eventually, hanging exactly where he left them. "I used to think that was sad. I don't anymore. I think some people need the emptying, and some people need to keep the fullness a little longer, and neither one is wrong." I finished the closet that night. Not all of it. I kept a sweater, her reading glasses, the coats, but more than I'd managed in 2 years alone, and I understood, driving Nina back to her rental, that I had needed a witness more than I'd needed permission. We didn't only talk about Claire and Walter. though they sat with us everywhere, like two extra chairs pulled up to whatever table we were at. Nina told me about the second graders she taught, how she'd had to explain to a room of 7-year-olds why she was missing over a week of school, how one of them had drawn her a picture of an angel wearing a name tag that said Grandpa Walter, and she'd had to leave the room to cry in the supply closet. I told her about the year Claire and I got married, how she'd insisted on a courthouse ceremony because big weddings, she said, were mostly performances for people who weren't actually going to help you carry the marriage, and how right she'd turned out to be about almost everything. That Thursday evening, on a walk along the river, we stopped near the old cotton warehouses to watch a tugboat push a barge upstream, and for a moment neither of us said anything, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off her sleeve. I thought about leaning down. I think she thought about letting me. Neither of us moved. This is strange, right? She wasn't quite looking at me. My father's heart, your wife, us, standing here, strange doesn't mean wrong. I know, I keep telling myself that. She didn't finish the thought, and I didn't push her to. We kept walking instead, close enough that our hands brushed twice before either of us worked up the nerve to actually take the other one, and even then it lasted only half a block before she let go first, laughing a little at herself. Neither of us mentioned it again that night. She told me later that her mother back home didn't fully understand why this trip was taking so long. "You're allowed to grieve him without turning it into a project, Nina," her mother had said on the phone, and the call had ended with both of them crying and neither apologizing. "Is this a project?" I asked, testing the word. She thought about it longer than felt comfortable. "I don't know what this is. I know it doesn't feel like something I'm doing for him anymore. It started that way. It doesn't feel that way now." I didn't ask her to say more. Some sentences are better left exactly as unfinished as the person who says them needs them to be. On Friday, her 6th day in Savannah, I told her I wanted her to meet someone. I didn't tell her who. Some part of me already understood that if I said Margaret's name out loud before we were standing in the woman's kitchen, I would talk myself out of it entirely. That turned out to be a mistake I only understood in hindsight. Margaret Bennett has lived in the same low-country house on the edge of the historic district for 40 years, the kind of house with a wraparound porch and a fig tree in the side yard that Claire used to climb as a girl. She still keeps a photograph of Claire on the mantel with a candle beside it that I don't think has gone out once in 2 years. I should have known better than to bring a stranger into that kind of shrine without warning. Margaret opened the door already smiling, the particular soft smile she saves for Sundays and surprise visits. And the smile stayed on her face right up until her eyes landed on Nina standing half a step behind me. "Margaret, this is Nina Calder. Nina, this is Claire's mother." "Calder," Margaret repeated it, looking from Nina to me, waiting for the rest, the way she waits for the end of any sentence that starts badly. Her father received Claire's heart. There was no gentle way into it, and pretending otherwise would only make things worse. He passed away in September. Nina came to find us. Something in Margaret's face rearranged itself then, fast, the way weather changes over a marsh. She didn't invite us in. She stood in the doorway with one hand still on the frame, and for a long moment nobody said anything, the fig tree rustling behind her in a wind I couldn't feel. "You should have called first." She was talking to me, not to Nina, her voice gone thin and careful, the voice she'd used at Claire's funeral when she was determined not to fall apart in front of 300 people. "You should have told me before you brought her to my door. I didn't know how to tell you without doing it in person." "You didn't know how to tell me at all," is what I think happened. Her eyes went to Nina, something almost apologetic crossing her face before it hardened again. "I'm sure you're a lovely girl, and I am sorry about your father, truly, but I let my daughter's heart go into a stranger's chest because it was what she wanted, because Adrian promised me it was what she wanted, and I have spent 2 years telling myself that was enough, that I didn't need to know his name, or see his family, or watch some other daughter grieve him in front of me. I don't think I can do this today. Margaret, don't. Quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. The lantern walk is in 3 weeks. I organize it every year, Adrian. You know that. I do it for her. If you bring this girl to it, I won't be able to stand at that podium and say her name. I mean that. Don't ask me to. She closed the door. Not hard, not a slam, just a soft, final click that landed louder than if she had. Nina didn't say anything on the walk back to the car. Neither did I. It wasn't until we were sitting in the front seats, engine off, that she finally spoke. I shouldn't have come to Savannah. I've made everything harder for everyone. You didn't make anything harder. I did, by waiting until the end of your trip to be brave about it. I looked at the house in the rear-view mirror, the porch light Margaret left on even at noon, some habit left over from Claire's childhood curfew years. She's not wrong to be angry. She's allowed to be angry for as long as she needs to be. That doesn't mean you did something wrong by coming here. Nina left for Charleston 3 days later, on schedule, on the 9th day of her trip. I stood at her rental car in the cemetery parking lot. She'd wanted to say goodbye to Claire and Walter both, in her own way, before the drive home. And neither of us made any promises we weren't sure we could keep. I'll finish the letter. Her hand was already on the window frame. I don't know when, but I will. Take whatever time you need. She almost pulled away, then stopped, leaning back out. For what it's worth, I don't think this started as a project either. Not anymore. I just didn't want to say it first. Then she was gone, taillights disappearing past the cemetery gates, and I stood there a long time before I remembered how to walk back to my own car. The stretch of quiet after Nina left was the strangest I'd had since the funeral. My apartment had gone from being simply empty to being empty in a way I actually noticed now, which is its own particular kind of loneliness, not the flat, familiar absence I'd lived inside for 2 years, but a sharper one, shaped exactly like a person who wasn't there yet but might be someday, if I didn't ruin it first. Most nights she called around 9, after her lesson plans were done and her own apartment had gone quiet. We didn't always talk about anything important. One night we argued, with real conviction, about whether a hot dog counts as a sandwich. Another, she read me a letter one of her students had written about the best day of summer, entirely misspelled and completely wonderful, until we were both laughing too hard to finish it. One morning, about a week after she'd gone back, a call came in during the 6 o'clock hour from a blocked number, which wasn't unusual. Half our callers hide behind blocked numbers. Night shift habits die hard. I picked it up on air the way I always do, half listening while I cued the next song. Coastal Mornings, You're On. There was a pause just a beat too long, and then a voice I would have known anywhere, even trying to flatten itself into a stranger's. Can you play something for someone driving to work in Charleston who still can't sleep past 5? I didn't say her name on the air. Some instinct told me to protect the two of us from whoever else was listening at that hour. I just said, absolutely, and played the same slow piano song I always play at 6:15, the one she'd asked about that first Wednesday in the booth. My phone buzzed 40 minutes later. You're not subtle, the text said. And underneath it, a second message, thank you. It was on one of those ordinary evening calls, not one of the heavy ones that she mentioned, almost as an aside, like it cost her something to say it lightly, that her mother had finally asked to see a photo of me. I sent her the blurry one from the cemetery bench, Nina said. She said you looked like someone who wouldn't waste her time. That's about the highest compliment my mother gives anybody. I drove to Margaret's twice in those weeks. The first time she didn't answer, though the porch light was on and her car sat in the drive. The second time, 10 days before the lantern walk, she let me as far as the kitchen table and let me talk for 20 minutes without interrupting once, which from Margaret is its own kind of forgiveness. "I'm not asking you to be happy about this," I told her. "I'm asking you to let it happen where you can see it, instead of somewhere you can't." She didn't answer that day, but 4 days later she called me, not the other way around, which hadn't happened since before Claire died, and asked, in a voice that sounded like it had rehearsed the question several times before dialing, whether the girl was coming back for the lantern walk, if she wants to. "I haven't asked her yet." "Ask her." A pause. "Tell her to wear something warm. That marsh gets cold at night." She hung up before I could say anything back. Nina came back 3 days before the lantern walk, and this time when I picked her up from the airport, she'd flown, some instinct telling her the drive would take too long for how much she wanted to be there sooner. She hugged me before either of us said a word, which answered a question neither of us had been brave enough to ask out loud yet. We spent that first afternoon back doing nothing in particular, walking through the market stalls near the river and picking up the hot dog argument exactly where we'd left it, until a vendor selling actual hot dogs overheard us and sided, unhelpfully, with both of us at once. It didn't feel like 2 weeks had passed. It felt like a sentence picked back up in the exact place we'd left it hanging. The lantern walk happens every year in early December, in the courtyard behind Marsh View Hospice, where the staff string 100 small paper lanterns between the live oaks, and families write the names of people they've lost on slips of paper, folding them into little boats to float down the drainage creek toward the marsh. Margaret has run it every year since the first winter after Claire died, when she told the hospice director that grief needed somewhere to go besides a headstone in the cold. The night before, Nina and I sat on the same iron bench where we'd first talked, a thermos of coffee between us this time instead of camellias, and she finally opened the wooden box. "I finished it 3 nights ago." She held the lid open but didn't take the pages out yet. "I think I rewrote the ending 11 times. The letter ran 4 pages, her father's handwriting for the first 2.5, hers for the rest, and she read it to me slowly, by the light of her phone, while the fog came in low over the pond exactly the way it had the first morning I'd seen her. Walter had written about the 14 months of waiting, about the phone call at 2 in the morning, about the strange, specific gratitude of hearing his own heartbeat again after years of feeling it struggle. He'd written that he thought about the woman whose heart it had been every single day, that he didn't know her name for the first year and prayed for her anyway, in his own clumsy way, every night before bed. He'd started, 4 separate times, to write what he wanted to say to her husband, and 4 separate times he'd stopped, because, in his own words, the ones Nina read last, her voice barely above the sound of the water, "I don't know how to thank a stranger for surviving inside my own chest without sounding glad she's gone. I am not glad. I would give this heart back in a heartbeat if it meant she got to keep it. I don't get to make that choice, so instead I will try to be worth it every day I have left, and I will ask my daughter to make sure her family knows that." I didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did she. When I finally reached for her hand, she let me take it, and neither of us needed the silence explained. Then she reached into the bag one more time and pulled out something small and soft, about the size of a fist, plain gray fabric with a seam running down one side. About a year ago, Dad asked his transplant clinic to help him record it, his heartbeat, so he'd have something real to send the family someday, instead of just words. They helped him put the recording in here. He never sent it. I think he was scared that hearing it back would feel like too much, for you or for him. He was never totally clear on which. She pressed a small seam at the bear's side. "I brought it because I think it's time somebody heard it who isn't me." I held it in both hands like it might break, and when the small speaker inside started its quiet, steady rhythm, unhurried, patient, Exactly the sound I remembered lying against Claire's chest 1,000 nights before any of this happened. I understood I was crying before I felt the first tear actually fall. It had never been a stranger's heartbeat. It was hers, still doing the only thing it had ever known how to do, 2 years and one entire other life away from where it started. Margaret found us like that. She'd walked down from the hospice parking lot to check the lantern strings before the next day's setup, and she stopped at the edge of the path when she saw us on the bench. Nina's hand still resting over mine, the small gray shape still beating steadily against my palm. I don't know how long she stood there before she spoke. "Is that?" She stopped, and I watched her put together, faster than I expected, exactly what she was looking at. I held it out to her without a word. She crossed the last few feet of gravel slowly, like the ground might change its mind under her, and took the little shape from my hands the way you'd take something newborn. She pressed it to her own chest with both hands and closed her eyes. Nobody said anything for a long time. The lanterns overhead swayed slightly in a breeze none of us had noticed start. When Margaret finally opened her eyes, they were wet, but her face had gone soft in a way I hadn't seen since before the funeral. 2 years, she said it mostly to herself. 2 years I've been so afraid of exactly this moment, and it's the kindest thing anyone's given me since she died. She looked at Nina properly then, the way you look at someone you've decided to stop being afraid of. "Your father sounds like he was a very good man." "He was. He would have liked you. He liked anybody who fought that hard to remember someone." Margaret held the little heartbeat against her chest a moment longer, then handed it carefully back to me. "Wear something warm tomorrow," she told Nina, echoing the phone call from days before, though this time there was nothing guarded in it at all. "That marsh gets cold at night, and come stand with us at the podium if you want to." Claire's name should be said by everyone who loved somebody because of her, not just the people who knew her first. The lantern walk happened the next evening exactly the way it always does. 100 small paper lights swaying between the oaks, families writing names with cold fingers, the creek carrying its little fleet of folded boats out toward the marsh grass, and, eventually, the tide. Margaret stood at the podium in her good wool coat and read the names each family had submitted for remembrance that year. And when she reached Claire's, her voice didn't shake at all, though I noticed her hand find Nina's on one side and mine on the other, holding both of us steady while she said it. Afterward, walking back to the cars under lantern light, Nina slipped her hand into mine without either of us making it into a conversation. It just happened, the way the easiest true things do. "I have to go back Monday. Report cards. 22 7-year-olds who've been drawing me pictures of Charleston to convince me to come home faster." "I know. It's only 2 hours." "I know that too." I looked at her under the swaying light, the small gray shape still tucked in my coat pocket, still beating its slow rhythm against my chest whenever I pressed my hand to it. "I've gotten pretty good at long drives lately. I might have to make a habit of it." She smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile I'd seen from her since the morning I found her in the wet grass, and didn't say anything else, because some things don't need to be finished out loud to be true. By the time the camellias bloomed again, the 2-hour drive between Savannah and Charleston had worn itself into something almost comfortable. A rhythm of Friday evenings and Sunday goodbyes neither of us complained about out loud, because complaining would have meant pretending it was a hardship instead of what it actually was, simply the shape our particular love had decided to take. Nina hadn't moved yet. We didn't talk much about when or if. Some things get to unfold at their own pace, and after everything both of our families had already survived, neither of us saw the point in rushing toward an answer that would still be there waiting in June, or October, or whenever it finally felt true instead of forced. That March, on a Sunday, the 3 of us drove out to Oakhaven together. Nina, Margaret, and me, with camellias from Margaret's yard bundled in damp newspaper on the back seat. Margaret laid half of them at Claire's headstone the way she had every visit since the funeral, and then, without anyone asking her to, carried the other half 2 rows over to a small granite marker where Nina had arranged, that winter, to have a portion of her father's ashes interred. A modest square that simply read, "Walter Calder, beloved father," and set them there instead. "Seemed wrong," Margaret said, straightening, brushing dirt from her knees, "that he'd come all this way and nobody ever brought him flowers of his own." Nina didn't say anything. She just reached for my hand, and then, after a moment, for Margaret's too, the 3 of us standing between 2 graves that had turned out, against every reasonable expectation, to belong to the same family after all.